trade policy review sometime before the actual trade policy review in the WTO. This is to allow a better understanding in some way and to facilitate perhaps questioning and a better discussion, both amongst FMG members, but also perhaps a better discussion with questions in the WTO itself at the review. For this particular review, we have, I think, a superb panel. Simon is going to lead us off using the Global Trade Alert to tell us about the policies and measures that SACU uses. Trudy will then talk with her views about SACU in general, but also about the process perhaps of decision-making in SACU. And then we have Tang from Lesotho, who is part of the WTO chair, and then Kutsi from Botswana, who was a member of the SACU Secretariat. So I look forward to a great discussion of this. And Simon, I'm going to lead off with you, give you the floor for about 15 odd minutes. Thank you, by the way, for distributing your PowerPoint in advance to the members of the panel. The floor is yours, Simon.
Thank you, Clem. I've just raised some slides. I hope you can see them. And,
yeah, I've got them on my screen.
Great. So I'm going to take you through a presentation of the evolution of SACU's commercial policies since their last TPR. I'll get straight to the conclusions, which are actually stated in the form of questions which arise from the evidence that I'll show you. I think there are 4 questions which might be usefully put to the SACU representatives. The first is, in what ways, if at all, have the high levels of unemployment and the stagnation that we've seen in SACU affected its trade policy at every level? And I will show you evidence that suggests that this region has been in very serious macroeconomic trouble. And it does beg the question how that colors their approach to engagement with the rest of the world. Secondly, I will show you evidence that points to a very miserable export volume performance and a quite stagnant import volume performance as well. And I think it's an interesting question to learn we should learn from the SACU representatives. Why is it that engagement with the global economy has been so weak since their last TPR? Then the third question arises from evidence I'll show you that the sectors which are favored by favoritism by SACU in its commercial policies have changed a lot. And what could account for this? Is this a matter of protecting industries which are under an onslaught from import competition, or is there some other logic, perhaps a industrial policy logic, which is less than evident to me? And then the last key finding is that there are going to be very few trading partners that are responsible for most of the discrimination against SACU's exports. And then the question is to what extent SACU can use its WTO membership to help address those barriers and advance its own export interests. So these will be the 4 questions which I will conclude with, and they are based upon evidence that I will show you now. The first set of evidence relates to the economic stagnation in SACU since the last TPR. In usual form, what I'm going to do is summarize on a qualitative slide the main findings and then show you the data to back this up. And so the main finding, or the main theme, is one of stagnation, as I've indicated, both in terms of economic growth and job creation. And I suppose on the trade side, we could also say market access and exports have also stagnated. This is a region where GNP per capita has not grown since 2008, which is a remarkable situation. Unemployment levels are extremely high, and where trade volumes have been fairly erratic. They have recovered somewhat from COVID-19, but appear to be decreasing in recent times. This is also a region where they source quite a lot from the EU and then also from China. So there are at least 2 big players in the trading system who presumably have a stake in this region. So let me quickly show you the evidence that backs this up. So here we have the evidence on the macroeconomic indicators. I'm afraid to say they're all awful. The only one I haven't mentioned up until now is real wage growth. And we have seen since the last TPR, real wages fall 18.2%, and they fell 9.6% in 2021 alone. So this is a region, low growth, falling wages, very high unemployment. There are some good indicators on terms of carbon emissions and gender gap, which is positive, but the overwhelming economic picture is one of stagnation. And the question then is to what extent this has influenced trade policy. On the trade side, it's not much better. Exports appear to have increased since 2016 in goods, but since 2021, there's been regression. Imports appear to be increasing in value, but as you will see in a slide soon, not in volume. And we also see on the service sector side a very mixed performance, with services export going down, whereas imported services going up. A couple of slides of charts to highlight this. Normally, we don't produce unemployment charts in these presentations, but given how high the unemployment levels are, you have to see it to believe it. You can see here that from 2015 onwards, when the last TPR has happened, we have very high levels of unemployment, above 16% in all of the members of SACU. And in the case of South Africa, this has risen considerably since the pandemic. When it comes to import volumes and export volumes, these by and large have stagnated since the last TPR. The reason for emphasizing the volumes is that, of course, these countries export a lot of commodities. And so the actual value of exports and imports fluctuates a lot. And so sometimes we strip out the price variations to see if the underlying volumes have changed. And by and large, the answer is no, with the exception of Eswatini. Import volumes have stagnated or not fallen, and that's shown on the left-hand chart. On the right-hand chart, with the exception of Namibia, we have export volume stagnation too. So overall, we have a region that's in trouble, that's not integrating as into the world economy anymore since its last TPR. And of course, there are interesting questions then as to whether, what factors are responsible for this, including policy. So that's the background, unfortunately not very promising. When it comes to policy change, I'm going to emphasize unilateral policy change. I'm sure there are other people on the panel who will talk about the regional developments, including the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I will focus on unilateral policy, drawing from the evidence that we have from the WTO and the Global Trade Alert. The findings on the policy as it stands today is that we have a tariff regime where 3/4 of imports are covered by WTO MFN obligations, as opposed to the provisions of regional trading agreements. So the MFN tariff regime in the case of SACU really matters. There is a significant tariff binding overhang. When we look at the measures in force at the moment, there are twice as many trade distortions as there are trade reforms. The trade reforms are mainly tariff cuts. The trade distortions are a combination of subsidies and tariff increases. And we will see that the number of countries which actually are taking measures, the number of countries facing discrimination from SACU is rather limited. So this will be a rather unique feature of their trade policy. I have a series of slides now which just amplify these points. The first is very much taken from WTO sources, showing that SACU may have RTA partners, but most of its trade is conducted under MFN terms. Those MFN terms involve a substantial amount of tariff water. There are duty-free agricultural and non-agricultural products, but most products have positive bound tariff rates. Binding coverage is almost complete, which is good news. When it comes to the evidence in the Global Trade Alert database, we have 198 measures which are in force on the 10th of September, which benefit trading partners. These are mainly tariff reductions which are in force. And when it comes to measures harming foreign trading partners, there are 464 of them, meaning that 70% of all the measures in force harm foreign trading partners. And these are mainly tariff increases and subsidy measures. The sectors which have benefited are listed here. They're very concentrated. 20% of the sectors benefit from 61% of all the harmful measures are concentrated in 20 sectors. And you can see here, it's a mixture of different products, many of which are ones which have faced increased import competition. In terms of the sectors, the countries which are exposed to trade reforms in SACU, we have mainly the ASEAN countries, the BRICS, and the EU as being potential beneficiaries, but really ASEAN stands out in terms of beneficiaries. And here, if you dig into the data, Singapore, Vietnam, and Thailand are principal beneficiaries. notice that whatever reforms SACU has done unilaterally at the MFN level, the LDCs are rarely beneficiaries, and neither is the African Union. So this may speak to why other collaborative instruments are needed. When it comes to exposure to harmful measures undertaken by SACU, we can see the LDCs are very heavily affected. So if you contrast the data on slide 14 and 15, the LDCs benefit very little from SACU trade reform and are exposed to lots of trade distortions. And here, Bangladesh stands out as the principal driver here. And in ASEAN, Thailand and Cambodia are countries which are largely affected. So what we have is, in underlying these numbers, actually a very small number of countries which are exposed quite heavily to measures by SACU. That's all I want to say about their current trade policy stance. Let's also talk about the evolution of their trade policy, unilateral policy since the last TPR. Here's the summary slide before I get into the charts. We can see that as far as extra SACU trade is concerned, there's been a steady increase in the share of imports facing new trade distortions and new trade reforms, but the share of share of trade facing new trade distortions is much larger than that facing trade reforms. This share of trade which has been affected by unilateral measures has grown steadily. It is not a pandemic phenomenon. What we see is that trade reforms largely take the form of trade cuts, trade distortions largely in the form of the subsidies to import competing firms. When you break down who is affected by the changes since the last TPR, half of the exports from China face some discrimination in SACU. So China is particularly affected. And as I will show you, the sectors which have benefited from protection have changed a lot. And the range of products affected by that protection is also quite limited. So SACU has an interesting pattern of protection. The protectionism is quite concentrated and it is changing a lot. Hence the question, what's really going on here? The first slide then to back this up is a summary slide showing the growing share of extra SACU imports which face trade distortions from SACU. The top red line with the boxes shows you that about 40%, 30 to 40% of SACU's imports face trade distortions that were not there at the time of their last TPR. Whereas on the trade reform side, you can see about half of that total is covered by trade reform. So there's a strong emphasis on or expansion in trade covered by trade distortions and less on trade reforms. If you break out what's responsible for this on the trade reform side, it's almost entirely tariff cuts, which have been piling up over time. It's not subsidy reductions. And on the risks to market access from trade distortions, it's a large subsidies to firms, which account for about 10% of the import coverage. But these two together account for the lion's share of the harm to market access. So that's really where the action is and maybe an area of concentration and questioning from members. In terms of which countries have been hit the most, the red line shows you the world average, which was on the last slide, and look at the brown line for China. Half of China's imports now face trade distortions that were not there at the time of the last TPR. In contrast, other regions in the world have been less harmed by measures by China in particular, by SACU, in particular the African Union. So the coverage of or the exports covered by different types of SACU interventions differ considerably across trading partners, and this may well be reflected in the discussions at the TPR. In terms of which countries are hit the most, there are 5 countries whose exports have experienced more than $1 billion of exports at risk since the last TPR. And this is Singapore, Germany, India, U.S.A, and China. And China really stands out as the country that SACU has taken the most measures against. And so this is very highly concentrated in this case. In terms of the products, which are a number of HS codes which are affected by protectionism and trade reforms, these are a remarkably low number. The total number of HS codes at the 6-digit level is over 5,000, and we can see that the number of HS codes affected is almost always less than 50. So less than 1% of all the HS codes are the beneficiaries of protectionism, and on the liberalizing side, apart from a jump in 2020 associated with liberalizing medical goods trade, you have a very small number of sectors which are HS codes which are benefiting from trade reforms. So SACU has a remarkable track record in concentrating its unilateral policy action in a small number of goods. And it turns out also that SACU has changed the sectors which are receiving protection as well. We have some sectors like iron and steel right at the top, where before the last TPR, they had less than about 4% of their protectionism was targeting the steel industry. Now that's gone up to 14%. So you can see big jumps there. And same in electrical energy, that's the bailout of the electricity company. Same in sugar and molasses. Same in grain and mill products. Same in food products and structural metal products as well. So we see we see some industries where there's a big expansion in receipt of protectionism. In contrast, meat products receive much less than in the past. So there are switches in sectoral favoritism which would be worth understanding. Is there an industrial policy logic to this, or is it?
Simon, you're breaking up.
Can you hear me?
You're breaking.
Yes?
Now we can, but you're breaking up occasionally.
Okay, there's not much I can do about that, Clem. So I'll just carry on. What the last section I want to go through is on SACU's stake in the world trading system. And here, I just want to highlight how much SACU's exports have been affected by other countries' measures. And this speaks to SACU's interest in staying in within the system and using it. The main findings we have is that since the last TPR, nearly 3/4 of SACU's exports to the rest of the world have faced one or more new trade distortions. And this is very much in line with the other G20 countries that we've reviewed. Whereas in contrast, only 1/4 of SACU's exports have faced better trading conditions on account of trade reforms abroad. And these are mainly largely tariff cuts, relaxed import quotas, and licensing requirements. And what we find is that the threats to SACU's exports are actually concentrated in 10 trading partners. So SACU, in that sense, has a very targeted set of countries it presumably should be concerned with. I have one slide to back that out. If you look country by country at which countries have taken measures which expose SACU's exports to worse trading conditions, it is dominated by China, and then followed by India, Germany, the U.S.A, and the United Kingdom, all covering more than $5 billion of SACU's exports. So SACU is quite unusual in that they have only 10 trading partners, which are responsible for most of the action against their exports. The rest of the world does not. So the question then is how to use their WTO membership to advance their commercial interests, given what is at stake. Let me conclude there. I do have some backup slides on the developments in South Africa's digital policies, which I'd be happy to listen to in Q&A. In the interest of time, I'll stop here and listen with great interest to the other presenters. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. One thing strikes me, and it struck me before when I heard the presentation, I mentioned it to you as well, was that when South Africa changed its regime and President Mandela came in, and the economic team led by Trevor Manuel and then also Alec Erwin, there was a remarkable move at that early time away from what had been very decided import competing policies, trade policies. And this seemed to continue until about the first decade of the 20th of our present century. But now, particularly since 2015, as your slides show, there seems to have been an increase again in support, in particular for certain selected domestic producers. Trudy, perhaps you can comment on that. Perhaps I'm misreading the data, but it strikes me that particularly since about 2015, the direction of change of trade policy has actually changed towards more protectionism. Trudy, I'm going to give you the floor next. Let me briefly introduce Trudy. She is Executive Director of the Trade Law Center, TRELAC. She's also a member of the WTO Chair's Advisory Body, and she is on the ECOSOC Committee for Development Policy. She does a lot of research particularly in areas like competition policy, and also delivers courses, trade-related courses, to policymakers throughout Africa. She has tremendous credentials for commenting on SACU, and particularly perhaps South Africa's role in all of this. Trudy, the floor is yours for 15, 20 minutes. Are you there?
I am, Clem. I'm just sharing my screen. I hope that's coming through to you.
Not yet.
That
Now
working?
it is. Yeah, we're okay. We're fine.
Excellent. Clem, I've taken the liberty to quote from your mail to me and your instructions, the request that you asked me to have a look at. And I think this is an extremely important discussion for SACU, and perhaps particularly also for South Africa. Colleagues, the bleak economic picture and trade performance that Simon has referred to is something that is particularly concerning. Unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, bedevils many, many challenges and policy-making initiatives, not only in South Africa, but SACU and for the Southern African region as well. The issue of protectionism is an extremely important one. I think, Clem, you're absolutely right. What we saw mid-1990 as we embarked on a new phase of development for South Africa was really encouraging. But I would say by the end of the 1990s, we start seeing signs of a turnaround. And what we see now, and in particular since 2015, is a consolidation, but also some new developments as far as protectionism is concerned. What I'm providing here is a little bit of background on SACU, the context for policy making, and of course, very important to keep in mind that we have 4 very small countries living beside or in the shadow of South Africa. The regional hegemon, when things go well, that's really great for the neighbors. When it doesn't, of course, contagion is a major, major concern. And so the inward-looking policies, not only in terms of trade, but taking a look at other areas as well, certainly impact the smaller countries in SACU. You've mentioned, Clem, very important to keep in mind that SACU has a long history, goes the way back to the late 19th century, first agreement 1910. The most recent agreement in 2002, many of us were really excited about. It created an institutional architecture for trade policy making and trade policy management, which would actively involve Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini. Keep in mind that Namibia is a latecomer to SACU, having joined on independence in 1990. But SACU is also an excise union, and I think this is important to keep in mind. Excise policy pretty much led by South Africa. All except Botswana, also members of the Common Monetary Area. So this brings our macro policy considerations into consideration, and the extreme volatility of the South African rand in recent years has played havoc in the smaller economies. The revenue sharing arrangement is often described as the glue that holds SACU together. It's a complex formula. It involves pooling customs and excise revenues and then sharing among the members in different streams, focusing on customs, which is determined by intra-SACU trade, so providing what one might argue is a perverse incentive to trade with South Africa in particular. There is the excise pool, so to speak, and that is shared in accordance with economic size, GDP. So I think that makes some sense. And then there's a development component. And analysts have in the past argued that this is some form of compensation for the lack of trade policy space, in particular tariff policy space, that the smaller countries actually accept as South Africa takes the lead on trade and tariff policy in particular. It's an extremely well integrated commercial space. And I think this is important both in terms of the industrial sectors, but also services sectors. Mostly South African firms lead that integration process. Intra-SACU trade, very important in the overall picture when we take a look at intra-Africa trade, accounting some years well in excess of 30% of intra-Africa trade in goods. South Africa's dominance, very important to keep in mind. South Africa's trade policy is led very, very seriously by industrial policy imperatives. And we have seen changes in the industrial policy in recent years, where we've moved from industrial policy action plans to master plans. And the master plans cover a very broad range of sectors. And Simon, this may be where you are perhaps able to draw some linkages to some of the measures that you're mentioning, the protection enjoyed by new sectors, so to speak. There is still a focus on core manufacturing, but it has broadened somewhat. Our trade policy is very much anchored on a strategic tariff policy that is used selectively. And this policy developed in 2010, minor amendments in November 2012, but no substantive change since then. 2021, we have a trade policy statement. It's really a 5-page document, which is a summary with minor changes since the 2010 statement. So not a great deal of work in terms of reviewing our trade policy strategy. No trade and services policy or digital trade policy statement at this stage. But I think, as Simon, you've indicated, there's a great deal of work in the regulatory space when it comes to digital economy developments, competition cases coming through, and so on, which I think are quite important for us to keep in mind. This I'll skip over. Just as far as the institutional architecture for trade policy making and management in SACU, the 2002 agreement, which entered into force in July 2004, provides for quite a comprehensive institutional architecture. Unfortunately, this is not all implemented. There is a commission, senior trade officials, council of ministers, notably the importance of the revenue sharing arrangement. This is a committee of trade and finance ministers. There are technical liaison committees for agriculture, customs, trade, industry, transport, and finance. But in recent years, they have not met. So effectively, that's become dysfunctional. This was a very important forum for articulation of trade policy issues and interests by BLNE countries, for example. Secretariat and Windhoek. The SACU Tariff Board was to be established. And this has not happened. And I'll say a little bit more about that. SACU Tribunal is provided for. That has not been established either. But we do now have a summit decision in 2010, and this was implemented in 2013. So we now have a summit. Full implementation of the SACU agreement, I think it's not likely in the near future, or perhaps ever. In the absence of the SACU Tariff Board, so this focal point potentially for customs union trade policy making, South Africa's national body, the Investigating Authority, International Trade Administration Commission, has a mandate from the SACU Council. Now, there's a decision, a council decision in 2005, which gave ITAC a mandate for 1 year to serve as the tariff board for SACU. There's a new decision in 2006, and this is open-ended. So this is still the situation now. So effectively, we have a national body which has a mandate in terms of national legislation, and therefore a national mandate to pursue South Africa's industrial and trade policy interests that actually now serves as a SACU body. Of course, there are channels for BLNS interests to be pursued. It is complex and complicated, and we don't see this working particularly well. We have seen in recent years a couple of interesting developments related to the initiation of anti-dumping investigations. 2021, I think, was the Pasta case, which we believe was initially discussed by a Namibian firm, brought on board a Botswana producer, and then had to bring on the South African industry to meet the necessary thresholds for the investigation to be undertaken by ITAC. National bodies, the equivalent of South Africa's ITAC, are being established in the smaller countries, but they are at various stages of development. Botswana, the most advanced, and Kutsi will tell us more about that. Trade negotiations, and we talk about trade and goods, of course, here, collectively undertaken. They're led by a designated member state, and this rotates depending on the negotiations. Trade and services negotiations, I think this is an interesting area, but certainly not a great deal of focus in the context of the customs union. They are conducted independently, and we see some interesting opportunities. In Namibia, for example, in recent years, as a result of the challenges in South Africa related to the transport sector, the transport opportunities, logistics, and so on, distribution services in Namibia have gained considerably as a result of that implosion, so to speak, in South Africa. Where does the private sector fit into this? And of course, there are national private sector bodies. The reality is that South Africa's large firms have direct access to key decision makers, and this reduces the need for formal policy guidelines and processes. But this is not good for small and medium enterprises, and certainly not for the other members of SACU, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini. Competitiveness issues and the challenges that we've been experiencing in recent years, I think, are a major issue when we take a look at protectionism as we experience it now. The governance and infrastructure service delivery challenges in South Africa, I would say, have strengthened protectionist stance as far as South African business in particular is concerned. As I mentioned right at the beginning, I think the protectionist tendencies are not new. I think if one takes a look at particularly South Africa's trade policy articulation, kind of reminders of mercantilist approaches. International trade arrangements, trade negotiations, and so on. You will all be aware that there's current debates and discussions about the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, South Africa's continued beneficiary status under that arrangement. It is quite important for South Africa, particular exports of motor vehicles. But the fact that it is not a trade agreement has a number of risks, which we are very, very much aware of in this part of the world, as some countries, notably Eswatini, have been excluded before by the United States. All SACU members or members of SADC, Southern African Development Community, the free trade area was launched in 2008. There is still implementation in progress. Protocol on Trade and Services, this is a first round of negotiations with 6 priority services sectors that entered into force in February 2020. 2022. So implementation is beginning. A next phase is being prepared as we speak. Then there are a number of other agreements that are quite important. And you will note that, of course, there is no trade agreement with China, as Simon has indicated. This is MFN trade with our largest trading partner in many sectors. The economic partnership agreement with the European Union, provisional application since October 2016, agriculture lagged a little bit. There is a review provision, and the review should have begun in 2021. It was somewhat delayed and is still underway. But there are some interesting developments because this is a trade and goods agreement. There was no overall appetite, particularly on the part of South Africa, to include trade and services and other disciplines. Following Brexit, there is an economic partnership agreement. It was really a rollover of the SADC EU Economic Partnership Agreement with the United Kingdom. SACU-EFTA, the European Free Trade Area Agreement, an interesting one, important, for example, for some exports from Botswana and Namibia. A review is ongoing there as well. The SACU-Mercosur FTA, it's a limited scope free trade agreement. South Africa, we refer to that as a preferential trade agreement. Negotiations with India to conclude an FTA, again, very limited ambition and focused on trade and goods. I think the divergence in terms of ambition and expected scope of the agreement has meant that we've not made much progress there. Turning to the African continent briefly before I conclude, the tripartite free trade agreement negotiations have not been concluded, but very important. This is an initiative to integrate 26 member states in Southern African Development Community. So all of SACU is involved there, the East African Community, and the Common Market for East and Southern Africa. It's a Cape to Cairo initiative, if you like. SACU and the East African Community have concluded tariff negotiations. Rules of origin negotiations are pretty much complete. And we're really waiting just for 3 ratifications for this to enter into force. You may well ask, so what happens to this, given the African Continental Free Trade Area? The AFCFTA, an ambitious continental integration arrangement, keep in mind that it builds on what exists already. So it will exist side by side with the trading arrangements within the regional economic communities, including, once up and running, the tripartite free trade area. So effectively, what the Continental Free Trade Area does is to liberalize trade amongst those member states that are trading under WTO rules, so that once operational, all trade on the continent will be under preferences, either bilateral agreements, REC, free trade area, or customs unions, and the continent or the Continental Free Trade Area. The negotiations are still underway. We haven't completed the tariff negotiations. And very important to keep in mind, the ambition is that we liberalize tariffs on 90% of tariff lines. It's really that remaining 10% that matters, because up to 3% of tariff lines may be excluded. And it's that final 10%, the division between the excluded products, up to 3% of tariff lines, and the remaining tariff lines, which are designated sensitive. Those negotiations have not yet been concluded. Rules of origin, we're still working on clothing and textiles, chapter 61, 62, and then automotives 87. So there is a plan to complete this by the end of the year. Very important, the AFCFTA has now been adopted as a framework for Africa's industrialization. So this brings into focus trade industrial policy linkages. And what has happened is that a formula quite similar to South Africa's industrial policy formula is being followed in terms of developing value chain strategies at a continental level, focusing on some of the priority sectors which are also on South Africa's priority list: automotive, pharmaceuticals, and a number of others. I've mentioned China. We have no agreement, but South Africa has signed a number of MOUs that relate to specific trade matters. For example, SPS for specific products, trade remedy investigations, and so on. Concluding remarks, I think the perennial concerns about the revenue sharing will not go away. There are periodic discussions about renegotiating the formula. It's highly contentious. BL&E want to industrialize, but with limited influence or access to tariff-related instruments, we see a lot of non-tariff instruments being used: import-export licensing, bans, closures of the borders, quotas, and so on. And so really interesting to see the ambition of the smaller countries to develop, diversify, industrialize, given the overhang, so to speak, of South Africa and South Africa's policy stance. The tariff board, in other words, that forum for effective engagement on trade policy issues and management of tariff-related and other policy instruments, has not been and is unlikely to be established. The latest discussions in recent years are about reimagining SACU with a stronger focus on industrial development, regional value chain development, following very much the South African formula for industrial development. It's putting much less emphasis on the agreement and implementation of the agreement, but rather cooperation to develop and diversify productive capacity, arguably very much needed. But if one takes a look at where the agreement may go, then at this point it looks very much as if we've almost exhausted the potential of achieving what was agreed in 2002. There's some interesting developments on customs cooperation. Quite recently, a mutual recognition agreement for the authorized economic operator, the preferred trader arrangements among the SACU members concluded. I think this is very, very useful. We're hoping this will be rolled out under the AFCFTA as well. Practical issues such as electronic data interchange, so real-time tracking, trade data reconciliations, and so on are being done. And I think this is extremely important, but undeniably, the smaller countries live in the shadow of South Africa's fortunes and misfortunes, its policy choices, and its dominant role in SACU. And therefore, they face very particular challenges when it comes to development policy choices. Thank you.
Thank you, Trudy. That was superb. And you're right, the smaller countries, I think, do face very particular challenges when faced with the South African dominance. The South African dominance it's real, but it's perhaps also noteworthy that of late, Botswana has become the economy with the largest GDP per capita in SACU. It has overtaken South Africa. And perhaps Kutsi, I might turn to you with that in mind. How does Botswana operate in the customs union? Let me introduce a few words of introduction. Kutsafalo Sekselokwane. May I call you Kutsi? She was on the Secretariat of SACU, has subsequently become a consultant, and I'm delighted to have her with us to comment on SACU, but also on the role of Botswana and the difficulties that perhaps Botswana faces, and bearing the congratulations that Botswana now has a GDP per capita higher than the dominant member of SACU, something that Simon taught me. Kutsi, may I give you the floor? Is she there? Hello? If she shows up on the screen and she is one of the participants, I don't know exactly what's going on at the moment. Anybody helping? Well, in that case, I'm going to turn to you, Cao Tang. Cao Tang is on the WTO chair in the University of Lesotho. I'm delighted to have her with us. Perhaps you can pick up the questions, but not with respect to Botswana, but with respect to Lesotho. How does Lesotho fit into the decision-making policy framework in SACU? How does Lesotho feel about the... I'm sorry, things are beginning to go wrong with my computer here. Simon, are things okay on your side? Because I'm getting very mixed signals on my computer. People are flitzing in and out.
I think it's okay, Clem, and I think perhaps so.
What about the rest of you? I cannot get hold of Kutsi. I don't know where she is. Cao Tang, can you come in now then?
Yes, I'm happy to come in.
You are there. That's great.
I am here.
Yeah,
I am here.
That's good.
Okay,
Why
perhaps
don't you pick up from where Trudy left off with the particular challenges that the smallers face in the SACU process? There you are. Yes, your screen is being shared.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes, I can see it, and I
Okay.
can hear you properly. I hope the others can.
Okay, great. Let me know if I start breaking up, and I'll just switch my video off.
That may be a sign.
I was looking forward to Kutsi coming before me because it's always difficult to follow Trudy. Let me see if I can minimize this. So my very brief talking points will follow as per this outline. So I will talk about Lesotho in the context of SACU, what is Lesotho's influence on SACU policy, and talk a little bit about how the policy of other members affect Lesotho and how Lesotho's policies can affect other SACU members. And I'll highlight a little bit the challenges to enjoying SACU benefits and just end with a way forward. So as Trudy mentioned about the smaller states in SACU, and Lesotho is one of the smallest, particularly the economy, Lesotho has very little influence over SACU policy, apologies. And this is primarily due to the small economy that we have does not give us much of a say in terms of the policies. And we can see this because from Simon's presentation on the policies that are harming external trade partners, those 70% of the measures, he highlighted that these come from tariffs and they come from subsidies and they come from trade remedies. So if you look at tariffs, what Trudy has just said is that the tariff setting body for SACU is South Africa's ITAC. So this therefore shows that Lesotho really does not have much of a say on these tariffs that are causing harm to external members because they are primarily set by ITAC. And in my research, ITAC is not a very collaborative body with the other BLNS members. Subsidies also are causing harm to SACU's external partners, but Lesotho does not really have financial capacity to provide subsidies. There are very limited subsidies for agriculture, amounting to only about $29 million in a year. But when you look at the subsidies that South Africa is employing, that's about 5 times only in agriculture alone. So more money as well as more coverage in terms of the sectors that are covered. So Lesotho subsidies cannot be said to be a cause of the harm that is being occasioned to SACU's external trading partners. Trade remedies also, Lesotho has very little technical capacity to undertake the types of investigations that are necessary for the implementation of trade remedies. Most of those remedies are instigated by South Africa. Also, if we look at the sectors where the harmful measures are, only 2 of those sectors are of particular interest to Lesotho. Lesotho's exports, which are apparels as well as agricultural products. But those represent a very limited share of where the harmful measures are. Most of the harmful measures are in manufactured products, in metals, in electronics, and these are not really products that Lesotho produces or exports, and therefore we're not benefiting from protectionism that is in those sectors, which shows that we're not really part of the thinking behind those types of measures. SACU, Simon did pose the question of whether the dire economic situation in the SACU members is affecting the measures that are coming out of the SACU members. And of course, this is happening, not only in terms of the measures employed externally, but also the measures that are being employed internally. For instance, we have import bans that have been implemented by Botswana and Namibia against horticultural products from South Africa. But if we look at policies by other SACU members that have affected Lesotho, Lesotho has been very affected by policies that have been instigated by South Africa that have harmed producers as well as consumers in Lesotho. And we can make mention of anti-dumping duties that have been levied against Brazil in 2022. I believe that these are now being reconsidered for removal, but they have really made Lesotho to be at the mercy of imports of chicken from South Africa, which is not the most cost-effective source of chicken. And also there are the recent safeguard measures that had been employed against chicken from the EU. And this was subject to dispute resolution within the SADC EU EPA. And as a result of that, that litigation, the money for that litigation was coming out of the SACU revenue pool. And this has also definitely affected Lesotho because of the shrinkages in the revenue pool, as well as the fact that it was making chicken imports into Lesotho to be more expensive because we did not have access to a cheaper source of the chicken. There's another case of rebates that have been made available to clothing producers within SACU, where they can get 100% rebate on imported textile and yarn. However, even though on paper it says that this is available to all clothing manufacturers in SACU, when you look at the implementation of that policy, South African clothing manufacturers are able to benefit from it. Because one, for a firm to be able to benefit, they must be registered with the South African Revenue Services. And also secondly, the implementation of the rebate system is undertaken by ITAC. So any oversight, any investigations or inspections that need to be conducted must be conducted by ITAC, which is remote from producers in Lesotho. And this is particularly deleterious to our producers because South Africa is one of the key markets for our exported clothing. So the inability for Lesotho producers to benefit from the rebate makes them uncompetitive in the South African market because the South African producers are able to benefit from this rebate. Lesotho, in terms of policies affecting SACU members, there have not been many measures by Lesotho that have severely affected SACU members. In 2021, there were some temporary bans on imported products, for instance, apples and tomatoes, but this was more because there was an overproduction of these products, and therefore the government decided to have a temporary ban to avoid the spoilage to farmers and losses to farmers. But this is not part of an overarching agricultural policy. This is more a haphazard reaction to circumstances that appear. So it's different from, for instance, the situation that I talked about with Namibia and Botswana, where they have these bans, not temporarily, but because they're trying to restructure their agricultural sector in the long term, in the interests of things like food security type of issues and lessening their dependence on South Africa in the region. So Lesotho is not really using these measures in the same way that Botswana and Namibia are. There have been certain policies implemented by Lesotho that are affecting the ability of members to export services into Lesotho, but services are outside the purview of SACU. So if we look at the preoccupation or the scope of SACU, we cannot really say much in terms of detrimental policies. Then what are some of the factors that are affecting Lesotho benefiting under SACU? Of course, we cannot lay the blame entirely on South Africa or other SACU members. There are also internal factors that are preventing Lesotho from being able to maximize its benefits under SACU. And some of them are internally the supply side constraints, the limited production that is happening within Lesotho, the limited competitiveness. There are policy and legislative failures or gaps that we see. Simon's slide, I think, that talked about what is happening in terms of e-commerce. If we look at Lesotho, the legislative environment, the regulatory environment for e-commerce is very underdeveloped. We do not have a current investment policy. The industrial policy has also lapsed and is still under review. We do not have a competition act or any competition bodies. So these types of gaps also limit our ability to be able to, because they're supportive of industrial and trade policy. So not having those policies also makes it difficult, as well as the political will to prioritize some of the reforms. Externally, there are still constraints to the free movement of goods. If you also look at trade facilitation, the trade facilitation barriers still continue to happen, despite the strides that have been made in terms of the authorized economic operators, for instance. The time to cross the border, the costs of trading with the other SACU states also continue to happen. Free movement of persons, were regressing in SACU in terms of free movement of persons. It used to be much easier about 10 or 15 years ago to be able to travel within the SACU members. But now, because of political and social conflicts, there has been a clamping down on the free movement of persons, which also affects the ability of the states to be able to trade. The declining SACU revenue also decreases the motivation for Lesotho to or decreases the benefits that Lesotho is getting from being a member of SACU, as well as the regional contestations that are undermining a common approach. I read about, what are SACU's commercial interests? I think it's very difficult to say these are SACU's commercial interests, because I think they're quite diluted and sometimes they are quite opposed to each other. So wrapping up, well, what is the way forward? And I found this quote to maybe be apt from The Tempest, William Shakespeare, that says, "Misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows." And SACU has really been at a risk for a very long time of being a union of strange bedfellows. And unless we have the kind of discussions that Clem mentioned at the beginning, where he said after the last trade policy review, there were discussions on having a common approach and ironing out the differences. Unless we have that on an ongoing basis, unless we're able to have a more cooperative and collaborative approach, a more inclusive approach, then I think SACU really is at threat in terms of its continued existence to the member states. Previously, when the share in the revenue was greater for the members, and this was, as Trudy said, compensating the loss of policy autonomy, then this was kind of holding them hostage. I don't know if in a good way or a bad way, I'm just saying this neutrally. But as the SACU revenue declines, as the share declines, there's less incentive for the members to continue to tolerate the dominance of South Africa in terms of trade policy. And this is going to cause more friction between the member states. So that is my 10 minutes exactly, I think. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you today.
Sartang, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much. And you're right. I mean, when this matter of the formula was actually discussed in the DG's office, I thought progress was being made. And subsequently, I'd learned from Minister Irwin that there had been agreement on certain changes in the formula to make the revenue sharing more equitable. I'm disappointed to hear that things have again deteriorated to the point where it has become, as Trudy mentioned as well, a very serious issue between the members. And that indeed, as you now say, Cao Tang, the lack of coherence, cooperation threatens, as you think, the very existence of SACU. I'm sad to hear that. Kutsi, I'm going to give the floor to you, and perhaps you can look at it also a little bit, these questions from the point of view, from your stance or your situation when you were in the Secretariat, from how the Secretariat views all of this, and then also, of course, from Botswana's point of view. May I give you the floor, Kutsi? I hope your connection problems have been solved. I think I was certainly seeming to go through them as well at one point. Kutsi, the floor is yours.
Thank you
You're
very
there.
much.
Yes. Oh,
and
thank heavens you are there. There's relief written all across my face.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, and apologies for the earlier issue. I think it's now sorted out. I've not prepared a PowerPoint presentation like the other speakers, but I'll try to react to some of the issues. And first, to appreciate Simon for the insightful presentation. You know, as I was going through it, I said, when you are inside the house, sometimes you don't tend to appreciate what is happening. And I noted a number of issues that you highlighted in the presentation, that when you are inside the system, you tend to miss out or not appreciate that these are the issues that are really affecting us. Maybe first to react to the issues around the BLNE's influence on SACU's trade policy. Trudy and Tsotang have touched on it, but just to say, inside the Secretariat, it was also one of the issues that we experienced as one of the highest concerns or the main concerns about among the smaller economies, because there was this view that they have limited policy space in terms of the trade policy, especially with the ITEC being the main body that plays a great role in coordinating the tariff setting arrangements for the region. And in turn, that also meant the other countries had smaller policy space per se when it comes to the industrial development's interest. But maybe to indicate that, maybe before I move to the next point, to say this also has affected one of the observations made, that the region has not made much progress in terms of growth, and issues around unemployment remains high. When I looked at the pointers raised, I said, this could have been maybe one of the issues could have been the issue around the region not also progressing on the aspect of industrialization. Because in the last TPR, we mentioned we are doing a lot of work around industrialization. But when you look at progress so far, we have not really advanced in that field. Lately, in 2020, there's been some progress, although not tangible, in terms of the region coming up with a refocused program around industrialization, focusing on regional development of regional value chains, export promotion and investment promotion. And this is one of the key pillars in the SACU strategic plan that was adopted last year. So we are hoping that through this strategic plan and the new focus vision by the SACU region, we're going to see that improvement, and most importantly, implementation by the region in terms of building or advancing in industrialization activities as a collective, because like Trudy said, having a bigger player and a smaller player, it has been difficult for the countries to converge on the industrial policy initiatives. And maybe also to move into, I'll not speak much about ITEC, but turning into Botswana's perspective. We have seen over the years, Botswana has become very firm in terms of policy, national policy goals and objectives, with a focus on diversification and issues around beneficiation, especially with the mineral sector being the key focus for the country, so that there's growth, there's value addition in one of the key commodities, which is diamonds. And this has in turn led to more focus on building stronger investment relations with the like of Botswana. And this year we have seen other players in the diamond industry also coming on board. And maybe also in line with the issue around protectionism or being inward looking. Yes, we have seen this emerging in Botswana and Namibia. Whereas the SACU agreement, I think it's Article 29, allows the member states to apply some of these measures to promote agriculture. the measures should be applied on a temporary basis. But lately we have seen Namibia and Botswana now making this to be like more long-term policies with the intent to promote the agricultural sector and ensuring food supply. There have been ongoing debates and discussions by the member states on how do we resolve this, because this is against the SACU agreement. If it becomes a long term, then it's against what we have agreed as a common customs union. So this is still an ongoing discussion, sometimes leading to negative discussion in terms of should we continue with this arrangement or should we not continue with it. Simon, you touched on the issues around trading services and digital trade. Trudy has already mentioned, and Sotang have mentioned in the case of Botswana, that there's been no appetite, especially from South Africa, to engage on issues around trading services. Initially, it was one of the sectors that was prioritized and forming the top 6 priorities for the region to advance. But then through the discussions in 2017, there was a decision by the summit that since SACU member states are members of SADC, we are going to now leverage on the existing frameworks at SADC to discuss issues around trading services. This also includes the issues around e-commerce. I learned that last month there was a workshop that tried to resuscitate discussions around e-commerce, but most of the focus or the key emerging issues messages was that since we're already doing the same work at SADC, we should rather focus on using or leveraging on what we're already doing at a bigger regional level at SADC. I'm trying to see what else I could have missed. I think let me stop here for now. If there's anything I have not touched that you want me to react to, I'll come back.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Before I open the floor, 2 questions. I wonder if we have another member from a SACU country with us, Justina Katepe. Justina, would you perhaps like to say a few words? I'm perhaps putting you on the spot, but perhaps a few words from you would be nice. Again, I don't know. Is it my computer that's going wrong? There seems to be no reply from Justina Katepe. May I then throw the floor open for questions? Wooly, I think Wooly is here. Wooly was the one who led the first TPR secretariat work on the first TPR of SACU. And perhaps, Wooly, you can comment, if you're there, on the development since then, on the process then and on the subsequent developments. I'm putting you on the spot, aren't I?
You are, Clem, but thanks, I know you. No, it's true that SACU was the first attempt to do a joint review, and it is true that it was the initiative and by Clem. I remember at that time I was working for him, and I was sort of doubtful and resistant, but Clem insisted and gave me instructions to do it. And with experience, we succeeded in doing these joint reviews, not only for SACU, but for other members as well. And it proved to be very, very useful. The idea was, of course, to do more TPRs, but also at the same time to try to give an opportunity to the members of SACU and other WTO members to review common policies and how the union itself, the union is moving. Of course, one can say that to some extent that there's not fully common trade policies, but it was very interesting to listen to the interventions, in particular, colleague from Lesotho, who spoke very openly. And what I gathered is that somehow maybe the policies or the actions taken by SACU as a group, not all of them are in line with the interest of individual members. Well, that probably can be said of many trade groupings. So it is interesting and very, very useful exchange of views. One question for Simon, and then a suggestion for the Friends of Multilateralism Group. Simon, when I saw one of the presentations again that some of the trade measures implemented by SACU were targeting more LDCs. I suppose that this is not because the measures themselves are discriminatory against LDCs, but probably it's because these measures apply to products that are of export interest to LDCs. So this is probably something, the situation. And the suggestion that I was making is because I find these exchanges of assessments and views extremely important and very useful. And I was thinking, and I can say it now because I'm no longer in charge of trade policy reviews at the WTO Secretariat, how to bring this assessment to the trade policy review meetings, the trade policy review body meetings. Of course, one is inputs of members, and I see that some members are attending. Why not envisage inviting the discussant? The discussant at the TPRB meeting has a bit more freedom to touch on some critical elements. So that could be an idea for the future, but certainly very, very useful exchanges. Thanks, Clem.
Thank you, Willie. And your suggestion of a discussant is useful. We'd need to be told who it was, of course. And would you, as director, have told me who the discussant was?
Yes, but this
You
is.
would have done that?
But I was saying for the discussant to benefit.
I take your point, and it's something that I think we might want to think about and take up. And thanks very much for your comments.
Yeah.
The floor is now open for questions and comments. We have a very useful comment from the UK congratulating this process for saving him an awful lot of homework, as he said. Would you like to comment, perhaps? You may be muted.
I've just unmuted myself. Thank you very much. Just to pick up the last comment. So, I mean, I came on today and thank you. I mean, I found that fascinating and really clear and illuminating, and great to have the different perspectives on it. So I think it's great if future discussants can be given this opportunity to save themselves on their homework. I suppose my question, particularly to those from SACU members, is about debate, because the way I hear this, I mean, it's not really working out terribly well, particularly for smaller members of SACU. And I wonder to what extent there's a debate on that, particularly within the business community, about how the policy is impacting on them.
Yeah, I don't know to whom one can direct that question. Trudy, you might be best suited to talk about that. You're more associated with Trellick. You may have dealt with these issues as well. And perhaps we can leave it till later, pick up one or two more questions, and then come back to that. But please bear that in mind, the debate. But there's also the matter of debate among the members themselves as to the making of trade policy. And I get the feeling that that is less than it used to be. But perhaps also you can comment on that, or Cao Teng or Kutsi, you could comment on that. My impression early on in the process, and in particular when Woolley was preparing the first TPR report, was that there was a fairly serious discussion among the members on trade policy measures. But perhaps I'm wrong. Anybody else want to come in? Please.
Clem, Sherry has her hand up.
Oh, I did not see that. Sherry, forgive me. Please, Sherry, come in. The floor is yours. Yeah, please put your hands up, guys.
Thank you very much,
I'll
Trudy.
try to pay attention.
Appreciate
thanks,
that,
Sherry.
Trudy. Thank you. Thank you, Clem. And really a million thanks to the speakers in this session. That's been extremely informative, starting with Simon's excellent presentation and insights as always, and then Trudy's incredibly extensive presentation of all of the ramifications and what's been happening in the SADC area. But Trudy, you covered absolutely everything. And me as a services expert, I was waiting for you to cover services in the AFCTA, because I was a little bit at the origin of that discussion and assisting the African Union Commission during the years prior to the launching of the AFCTA. And one of the accomplishments that I that they felt they had achieved at the time was getting services to be part of phase 1 of those negotiations and selecting a certain number of priority sectors for attention in that first phase. Maybe you didn't comment on it on purpose because little has happened, but if you had anything to say as to where that's gone and where it's moving, are there any other priority sectors that have been now selected and so forth? And then I really enjoyed the presentations from the smaller members, the 4 smaller members of SACU. I think if I were a smaller member and had very little influence over trade policy making effectively, as has happened over the last 2 decades, I might be prepared to look a little bit elsewhere at this point in terms of promoting my economic development. And the one place I would look would be to the service sector, because that is a sector where countries can develop without heavy one, subsidization, and 2, emphasis on manufacturing, which requires infrastructure construction and so forth. Services require the development of human skills. And so, of course, it takes capital and expertise, but it is fairly easier to adapt to a smaller country environment. So I'm wondering for the smaller members of SACU, if they might be better served by looking elsewhere, for example, in the WTO, in the e-commerce negotiations, in the plurilaterals, where those interests are actually being discussed, and yet, most or many developing countries are not participating. So those are the 2 questions that came to my mind when listening to this really excellent session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry.
Mm.
I've just realized that we're beginning to run into some time problems, and I'd like to give the floor back to the 4 panelists. And before I do that, let me thank you very much. I think we've been extremely lucky in the 4 panelists. We've had very good interventions from them. From what I have heard, bearing your questions in mind as well, Sherry, but I really am a little disturbed, as it were, by, in particular, Cao Tang, what she said about the potential breaking up almost of SACU, and then I wasn't very much put at ease by Kutsi's comments, which seem to support that almost. I therefore worry about the decision-making process, the cooperation within SACU, and perhaps, Trudy, you could lead off with that particular issue. Am I correct in being just a little disturbed by all of this? It's yours, Trudy.
Thanks so much, Clem. I think this concerns all of us. The reality.
You're welcome.
I don't know what happened.
Siri interfering on my screen here. Apologies
Okay.
for that. I think, Clem, we're all concerned about SACU going forward, legitimately so. And the concerns really come in waves. And the revenue dependence, it really is a bit of a golden handcuff. But there comes a point with declining revenue pool where the smaller countries actually do have to decide whether this is worth remaining in the SACU arrangement. But there are some worrying tendencies. And Kutsi perhaps should speak to this, because what we are seeing in Botswana, and you're right, Botswana has stood apart to some extent from the other smaller countries. It really has made great strides in terms of economic growth and development measured, for example, by per capita income. However, its revenue dependence in recent years has actually increased, so much so that the latest figure Kutsi can confirm is that 30% of public revenue comes from the SACU revenue pool. Now, that's a serious consideration. So I think the discussion about do we continue as the customs union or not is a serious one. As far as the debates in the private sector, there's some discussion, particularly when they encountered challenges. So, for example, there are South African firms who've established commercial presence in Namibia, and they then face quota restrictions on imports from South Africa. Then they complain bitterly and go to the local courts. And then there's a debate. But to be honest, there isn't an ongoing, robust debate in the private sector, to my knowledge, but I think Kutsi and Tsotang can help us there. As far as services is concerned, Sherry, absolutely correct. We certainly agree with you that services sector development and trade and services offers particular opportunities. And here we have seen, for example, in the case of Namibia, strong focus on transport and logistics. They have the benefit of corridor development, so the Trans-Kalahari corridor from Walfish Bay, cutting across through Botswana, across some of the neighboring countries. So they have been prioritizing those developments. What we've also seen as a result of challenges in South Africa and the transport sector is the development of regional value chains, new configurations developing. So, for example, manganese mined in the Northern Cape of South Africa is no longer actually exported via the Saldanha Bay port, which was developed, and there's a dedicated train line. None of that works. So the manganese is trucked to Namibia, then goes via train, which is operated under a concession by a private mining company and exported from Namibia. So I think you're absolutely right. When one takes a look at services, and it's not just the transport and logistics sectors, extremely important. The SADC services agenda is an interesting one. There are 6 priority services sectors. The AFCFTA has 5. The SADC list includes, for example, energy-related services. The AFCFTA does not. In the AFCFTA, we have finance, transport, communication, professional services, and tourism. The negotiations are still underway. So countries in SACU have been actually quite proactive in developing their services offers. But to be honest, we don't see much beyond what we already have in terms of GATS commitments or SADC commitments, which mirror very much what we have in the GATS. An interesting development in the AFCFTA is regulatory frameworks for regulatory cooperation. And I'm cautiously optimistic that this may start highlighting those pernicious regulatory barriers and perhaps a focus not only on cooperation, but eventually on harmonization to bring some benefits to service sector development across the continent. In terms of new sectors, there is interest and appetite to include distribution services at this point, but not many others at this stage. So it's very much dependent on the state parties to bring requests for the addition of new sectors. So the aim, obviously, eventually to continue to second and third rounds of negotiations, but the first round is not yet complete. So
you
no
wrap up, Trudy?
liberalization yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We're virtually running out of time. I'm going to go quickly, if I may, first to Kutsi to follow up a little bit on what Trudy was saying, then to Tsotang, and you've worried me a bit, and then end up with Simon, and then we'll wrap up. About 1.5 to 2 minutes each, if I may. Kutsi, the floor is yours. And there again may be connection problems. Tsotang, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, again, will you come in now, please, following up? And you have worried me with this notion of it all breaking up.
Yes, it gets worse. But just to wrap up from some of the questions, the one question was whether the private sector is able to make any impact on the Lesotho government. With the consultations that I've had with the private sector, they basically say that the government does not include them, the government does not consult them, and they don't know what is being said out there in the negotiations. But if you look at the private sector themselves, they also tend to be quite dispersed and disorganized which then does not make them a very effective lobby to the government in terms of getting their interests raised in SACU and in other bodies. If you look at the public officials, I've had public officials tell me that they're intimidated by officials from the Republic of South Africa, that they're fearful of South Africa retaliating if Lesotho was to try to take a harder stance against some of the measures that are coming out. And this is due to our overdependence on South Africa. Most of our imports come from there. A lot of our exports go to there. We're dependent on South Africa for our services and for employment. So therefore, it's very difficult to say that Lesotho can really push back. And what Trudy's saying about Botswana is correct. The BLNS countries used to caucus together against South Africa, but we're seeing this trend that now it's becoming each to their own. So that strong united force that we used to have against South Africa, we are actually losing it. And what Sherry said about concentrating on services, definitely Lesotho would have a greater advantage in terms of services. But one of the things that we're seeing is that the priority areas that have been identified both in SADC as well as the AFCFTA, your construction, your transport, financial services, we're not very strong or competitive in those sectors. We're stronger in sectors, for instance, it could be education or business services. Well, tourism is there. Or healthcare services. So we still have some ways to go in terms of benefiting, even if we look towards services within SADC and the AFCFTA, because they're not really prioritizing the service sectors where we have a likelier advantage over the other member states.
Thank you very much, Sotang. Kutsi, if you're there, you appear to be muted, but perhaps you can hear me. If you're there, please unmute and come in. Seemingly not. Maybe there are still connection problems. I will then turn to you, Simon, for a last few words on the matter.
Thanks, Clem. One question was put to me by Willie Alfaro about the apparent targeting of the LDC exports. I want to make very clear here that when we identify specific countries which have been either are at the receiving end of trade measures from other countries, you might have seen on slide 22, we differentiate between measures that only affect their country and measures that are MFN measures, okay? And I can confirm in the case of measures taken against the LDCs, these are principally SACU measures raising import tariffs on textiles and apparel, and the principal country which is affected is Bangladesh. And so this is essentially what's going on here. And I think this is part of a broader piece that we saw in the statistics that I presented, that when it comes to competition from low-cost Asian rivals, SACU has been raising trade barriers. And so that's why I hinted at whether or not there were defensive considerations associated with the protectionism being taken by SACU.
Okay. But Simon, is it also correct to say that SACU has been protecting, and in particular perhaps led by SACU, has been protecting domestic industries, and textiles and textiles in particular are important in South Africa?
That's true, but I think textiles
are doing it for domestic reasons. Yeah,
I agree. I think that's consistent with the fact, but let's not forget that there are other SACU members who have textiles and apparel too. And so this is a case where it might not be South Africa throwing its weight around. It could well be other countries apparently benefiting from these measures.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Simon. We need to wrap up now. Thank you all very much for being here. And thank you very much again to the panelists. I think you've done a superb job. We do now need to sign off. So this meeting is now over. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Clem. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.